Global mass production didn't start in the West. It didn't start with the Industrial Revolution, or steam engines, or Henry Ford. 1,200 years ago, Chinese factories were already mass manufacturing custom goods for the Middle East on a scale that defies belief. Imagine a world where you could order 10,000 customized plates from a factory 3,000 miles away, pay with a line of credit, and have them delivered by a multinational shipping crew, all without a single telephone, computer, or lawyer. This system rivaled the economic output of the world's greatest land empires and connected more people than the Silk Road. But the most incredible part: the world's richest trade route had no single superpower, no global police, no one central government, and no rigid borders. Welcome to Know History. Today we're going to uncover the global economy that history books forgot to tell you about. Everyone knows how the modern world was built. We have a standard story for globalization. It goes like this. For most of human history, trade was local, slow, and dangerous. We imagine that if ancient people traded at all, it was for tiny, precious things. A bag of spices here, a bolt of silk there. Luxury goods for kings and emperors, carried across deserts by camels or hugged along coastlines by terrified sailors who didn't dare lose sight of land. And the assumption is that real industry, the ability to make thousands of identical things for a mass market, is a strictly modern invention. After all, without electricity, without steam power, and without modern contracts, how could you possibly run a global supply chain? I believed this story for years. It makes sense. We tend to think of the past as small. We think of ancient economies as subsistence-based. People growing their own food, making their own clothes, and maybe trading a chicken for a pair of shoes. If you open a standard textbook, it will tell you that the European Age of Discovery in the 1500s was the moment the world finally connected. That before the Portuguese and Spanish ships arrived with their cannons and compasses, the Indian Ocean was a sleepy backwater of primitive traders. This is the Eurocentric view of history, that the West brought order and scale to a chaotic world. It suggests that without a powerful state to enforce contracts, without a navy to protect shipping lanes, and without industrial technology, globalization is impossible. And the evidence seems to support it. Look at the Roman Empire. It needed legions of soldiers to keep its roads safe. Look at the Silk Road. It collapsed every time the Mongol Empire or the Chinese dynasties fell into chaos. So, naturally, we assume the ocean was even worse. A lawless void where trade was impossible without a gunboat. This is what I thought, until I saw the bowls. In 1998, sea cucumber divers off the coast of Belitung Island in Indonesia stumbled across something that shouldn't exist. They found a shipwreck. But not just any shipwreck. This ship sank around 830 CE. That's the 9th century, the height of the Tang dynasty in China and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Now, if the standard story were true, this ship should have been carrying a small, precious cargo. Maybe some royal gifts, maybe a few chests of silk. Instead, archaeologists found this: 60,000 ceramics. Let that number sink in. This wasn't a royal gift. This was a commercial shipment. And when you look closer at these bowls, the primitive narrative completely falls apart. These weren't traditional Chinese designs. They were decorated with geometric patterns and Arabic calligraphy. They were made in China, yes, but they were designed specifically for the middle-class market in the Middle East. Think about what that means. In the 9th century, a factory owner in China knew exactly what a customer in Baghdad wanted to put on their dinner table. He took an order, retooled his production line, manufactured tens of thousands of units, and shipped them 5,000 miles across the ocean. If trade was so dangerous, if the ocean was so lawless, how could anyone risk this much capital? You don't load a fortune onto a wooden boat unless you are 99% sure it's going to get there. The Belitung shipwreck isn't just a tragedy, it's a contradiction. It proves that 700 years before Columbus, there was a supply chain that looked suspiciously like Amazon or Alibaba. So, if there were no navies patrolling these waters, and no telephone lines to track orders, how did the system actually work? To find the answer, we have to look at the invisible engine that drove the world. Let's start with the hardware, because before you can have trade, you need a way to get there. History books love to talk about the Vikings. We're told they were the great explorers of the era. But while the Vikings were hugging the coasts of Europe, a different group of sailors was doing something physically impossible. The Austronesians. Around 300 to 500 CE, these sailors from Southeast Asia didn't just sail, they vanished into the open ocean. They crossed 4,000 miles of open water, from Indonesia to Madagascar. That is like sailing from London to New York, but without a compass, without a map, and in a canoe. They didn't just visit, they colonized. We know this because they brought their lunch with them: bananas, taro, water yams. These are Asian crops. They don't belong in Africa. But suddenly, they appear in the archaeological record of East Africa, fundamentally changing the African diet. This proves that long before the Age of Discovery, the Indian Ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. But how did they do it? Did they just get lucky? No, they had a secret weapon: the wind. For centuries, Western history claimed a Greek sailor named Hippalus discovered the monsoon winds around 45 CE. That is, frankly, ridiculous. Local sailors, Arabs, Indians, Malays, had known about these winds for 1,000 years. The Indian Ocean has a unique feature: a wind system that reverses direction like clockwork. In the summer, the southwest monsoon blows you from Africa to India. In the winter, the northeast monsoon blows you back. It's a predictable, natural conveyor belt. This meant you didn't need to be a brave explorer, you just had to be patient. This predictability lowered the risk, and when risk goes down, volume goes up. But wind only solves the transport problem. It doesn't solve the trust problem. If I send you 60,000 bowls, how do I know you'll pay me? There were no international courts. If a merchant in India ripped off a supplier in Cairo, who would you call? The police? They didn't exist. The answer lies in a dusty storage room in Cairo called the Geniza. Inside, scholars found thousands of letters from Jewish merchants, preserved for centuries. One man, Abraham ben Yiju, lived in Mangalore, India, in the 12th century. His letters revealed the software of this trade network. He wasn't trading with contracts enforced by a king. He was trading on reputation. The system worked like a medieval credit score. If you cheated someone in Aden, news would travel on the monsoon winds faster than you could sail. By the time you arrived in the next port, your reputation was dead. No one would trade with you. You were ruined. This reputation mechanism was stronger than any law. It allowed Jewish, Muslim, and Hindu merchants to form partnerships that lasted decades, crossing religious and political lines without a second thought. So we have the transport, we have the trust, now we need the product. The Belitung bowls didn't come from a small village potter, they came from the Changsha kilns. These were industrial complexes. We're talking about dragon kilns that climbed up the sides of hills, capable of firing tens of thousands of pieces at once. Archaeologists have found evidence of assembly lines. One worker shaped the bowl, another applied the glaze, a third painted the design. They even used cobalt blue pigment imported from Iran, raw material shipped 4,000 miles east to China, processed into paint, applied to bowls, and then shipped 4,000 miles back west to be sold. That is a global supply chain in the 9th century. But the most shocking piece of evidence isn't what we found, it's what we didn't find. In all the records of this era, the letters of Ben Yiju, the travelogues of Ibn Battuta, there is no mention of a single empire ruling the entire ocean. While local powers like the Srivijaya Empire in Southeast Asia used navies to police the Malacca Strait and enforce trade taxes, and the Chola dynasty of India launched naval expeditions to secure their routes, no one state was the police of the high seas. And the idea that China only had a river navy? By the 12th century, the Southern Song built a massive permanent standing navy to protect maritime trade. Later, the Ming dynasty's treasure fleet under Zheng He became the most powerful blue water navy in history, reaching Africa decades before the Europeans. For nearly 1,000 years, the Indian Ocean was a space of maritime pluralism. Piracy existed, but because no single state tried to monopolize the entire system, trade remained remarkably open. Merchants didn't carry cannons for conquest. They didn't need to. The cost of total naval war was higher than the profit of trade. So everyone just traded. Until 1498. When Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, he wasn't impressed by the peaceful market. He was confused. He saw a wealthy trade network with no central defenses, and to a European mindset, that looked like weakness. The Portuguese didn't enter the market to compete, they entered to dominate. They introduced a concept that was alien to the Indian Ocean, the cartaz. It was a protection racket. You buy our pass, or we sink your ship. Suddenly, the ocean was militarized. The trust networks shattered. The reputation economy was replaced by state monopolies. We often tell the story of the Europeans opening up the world, but the truth is the opposite. The Belitung shipwreck proves that the world was already open. The revelation is that we didn't need a single global superpower or industrial gunboats to build a global economy. We just needed a predictable wind and a reason to trust each other. The Dark Ages weren't dark. They were just lit by a different kind of light. The glow of a kiln in China and the stars over the Indian Ocean. What does this mean for us today? We live in a world where we assume that global trade requires global power. We think that without a dominant navy patrolling the straits or the World Trade Organization enforcing rules, commerce would collapse. But the Indian Ocean system reminds us that commerce is a natural human instinct. It reminds us that systems built on mutual profit are often more durable than systems built on force. The Portuguese Empire lasted a few centuries. The monsoon trade lasted a millennium. This shipwreck teaches us that we aren't the first people to live in a globalized world. We're just the first ones to think we invented it. This shipwreck reminds us that true power isn't about controlling the ocean, it's about learning to sail with the wind. But the Indian Ocean isn't the only place where history is hiding a lost economic miracle. I'm here to help you know the merchants history forgot. What other ancient technologies do you think we've underestimated? Tell me in the comments. See you at the next harbor.